Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
Who is Jim Highsmith? How would you answer that question?
Well, I guess there's two aspects of it. One is the career aspect, and the other one's a family aspect.
Can you separate the two? Can you separate the two?
No. But I've been at this game about 60 years, and so I have a family. I have a wife, two kids, two grandkids. And in fact, I started working on this book as a memoir to my grandkids. And then it kind of exploded out from just that. So I've got a background in both engineering and management. I've brought those two things together throughout my career. And I've always been an adventurer. So I do a lot of outdoor things, everything from racing sailboats to climbing mountains. And so that's been part of my, it was kind of separate, but it became integrated together in the 90s when I started thinking about the precursor to Agile development and thought about my experiences climbing mountains and how projects were running differently than climbing mountains, and yet they needed to be running the same. So one of the first articles I wrote in the early 90s was about looking at software development and mountain climbing and looking at the analogies. Mm-hmm. And then career-wise, I started off working on the Apollo program out of engineering school, and then moved on into the business area, into software development, and got a master's degree in management, and then kind of went from there. And in the background of my video, you see a guy sitting down with punch cards input and paper output, and that's how it went when I started.
It's just like reading through your book. It's been really interesting, and your newest book, Wild Wild West to Agile: Adventure in Software Development, Evolution and Revolution. This is not your first book. You've written many books. Maybe just I'm curious because I've been working on a book. Haven't been able to finish it. I have about 40,000 words, 9 chapters. But I'm interested, what got you into writing, and how did you write your first book? And just could you maybe spend a little bit of time talking about why it's writing important to you and how you got started?
I actually have some family background. My grandfather on my mother's side wrote 25 books during the 20s and 30s, and during that period of time, magazine articles were big, and he must have written 500 or 1,000 magazine articles. So I had that in my background. He also taught writing at NYU, and my mother was a writer, although when she started to have a family, she sort of had to put the writing aside. So I had some writing in my background, and I've always been a reader. And during the years, I wrote a few things. I wrote the first kind of professional article in the late 1970s. And then I got into the 90s, and it was sort of hanging there on my bucket list of wanting to write a book. And so I started in about 1995. And the first book from start to finish took about 5 or 6 years. The last book took 15 months. So I learned a lot. But one of the things that I've tried to do with my writing is I've tried to not only make it informative, but interesting and enjoyable to read. And so I've always tried to use different kinds of things to make the writing more enjoyable, making it more personal, putting in a lot of stories, doing some interviews with people. And so in this latest book, I've sort of used all of those techniques to make it, as I said, both informative and enjoyable.
And I think that stands out, like all the stories that you've written, like analogies and all of those things are, I mean, like, I think that those are important, not just in writing, but like, you know, as a consultant, you talk about being a consultant and, you know, spending 30 years as an independent consultant. I think that story telling and using analogies and things like that is a big part or big skill that consultants, coaches, others. I mean, when I say coaches, I guess I mean more agile coaching, which includes consulting and professional coaching. But what are your thoughts on 60 years of professional experience, 30 years in independent consulting? How important are storytelling skills to our craft?
Well, the longer I've been in the game, the more important I think it is. I think storytelling is an art that it really helps communicate. I look at stories as frameworks to hang information on. If you go to a presentation and all you get is bullet points, you get overdone on about the third slide. If you've got some stories and then you can hang the information off of those stories, people remember the stories and then they remember the information. And I think too many technical people get all balled up in trying to get all their ideas down. Yeah. And they have to realize that people aren't really interested in their ideas unless they can tie it to something. Yeah. And that's why I think storytelling and communication is so important. I have really harped with my grandson. I've talked to him a lot about writing. He's probably going to go into a technical field. And if you want to make yourself known and understood, whether it's internal, whether you're doing a presentation, whether you're writing an internal document, whether you're writing an article, that you really have to communicate that well. And you do that through various writing techniques. And so one of the things that I looked at early on in the 90s was this idea of creative nonfiction. So you write nonfiction, but you write it in a creative way that engages people. Because if you don't engage them emotionally, you're not going to engage them intellectually.
That's a really good point. And if you don't engage them emotionally, you're not going to engage them intellectually. That's something that I like that. But even you talk about Ken Orr, and at one point in the book, you talk about his storytelling skills and ability to tell stories and just capture the audience's attention. And he was one of the people that you mentioned that had a huge impact on your career. Maybe we can come back to people that influenced you, as you spend a decent amount of time in the book about that. But
and that was one of my objectives of the book, was to bring to the new generation some of these people who really led the way and pioneered in other eras that enabled Agile to take place.
Yeah, and I really like, and maybe we'll go through the 4 sections: Wild West, structure, roots of Agile, and Agile in that order. But I'm interested from your perspective and consultant perspective, what are the pros and cons of being an independent consultant? You've spent a lot of years, and today we see a lot of people, when I talk to them, they're like, Milan, I'm thinking going independent, but it feels daunting. It feels, dangerous. What would you maybe tell people that are thinking about going independent? Like, is there anything that you would like to share on that topic specifically?
Well, I was independent, but also for a fair amount of that time, I was linked to another organization so that I was. So that they did most of the marketing and sales, and I did the consulting. So I worked for a number of years for the Cutter Consortium. And in fact, I was a director of Agile project management, but I wasn't an employee, I was a contractor. And so they handled a lot of things for me. For example, I was at a conference one time, and somebody from a large telephone company asked me if I'd come do one day of consulting. I said, sure. So he sent me the contract. It was like 20 pages long, and required a background check and a drug test and all of this information. And so I said, it's not worth it for a day's consulting. But I said, if you really have to have that, I've got an organization that I work with. I'll see if they want to handle all the paperwork. And so it went from $1,000 a day to $2,000 a day to have them handle the paperwork.
Which which is, I think, a good metaphor for a lot of things, like just how we do and how we've done, because of just additional processes, things that, we don't keep it lean, and for various reasons. But let's maybe dive into the book, and I would like to explore some of these concepts. I've listened to your podcast or interviews with a couple other people recently, so I'm trying not to also ask you the same questions for your sake.
That's one thing I really enjoy about the podcast is everybody does ask sort of different questions, and that's really, this is kind of the first time I've done things like this. I used to just give more presentations at conferences. And I found that I like this a lot better than presentations at conferences, because everybody asks a slightly different set of questions, and you can engage in different ways with different people. And I really like this format.
Yeah, me too. That's one of the things. It started as a selfish thing. Like during COVID, I was like, I just want to start talking to these people that typically like I've run into conferences, and it's been just a pleasant. It seems like people that I'm interviewing enjoy it, but also I enjoy these. So coming back to the book, and maybe I want to set as a couple of things as a base, but you use Cynefin as from Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge as a base to kind of tell a story around how we went from Wild West to structure to roots, and you kind of map it out a little bit to, not a little bit, but you map it to spaces or the states in Cynefin. So before we explore Cynefin, I guess, could you maybe just briefly discuss the 4 Wild West: structure, roots of Agile, and then we'll kind of use the Cynefin to go through each one of those and maybe have a discussion throughout, like how, as a time progressed, how that changed, and how perhaps also complexity increased. And I do have a question too. I know you attended one of the conferences on complexity management, so I want to talk about that too. But how could you maybe just, how did you come up with the idea for the 4 kind of it's almost like 4 paradigms,
Right.
Could you maybe talk about those 4 first, and then we can talk about the subsections within each?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how that arose, because like I said, I started out writing this as a memoir to my grandkids.
Yeah.
And I thought, they're not going to be very interested because they're both teenagers. They may not be interested anyway. But I do know that they've looked at it. So I wanted something that would be of interest to them, and just kind of doing a resume style. I worked here and I worked there and I worked the other place. Didn't seem to me to be very interesting. So I started thinking about how to organize. And I thought, I've been at this game nearly 60 years. Maybe there are different periods of time. And as I started looking at those periods of time, I started coming up with those eras. And it really had to do with the evolution of technology, management theory, and software development. And one of the things that I talk about in there is that software development is evolved as the technology evolved and as management theory evolved. And those 3 are really tied together. And that's why I wanted to pull, for example, different kinds of frameworks in, to like the Cynefin, to look at things like change and management theories and those kinds of things. So the first era was
maybe just to take a step back, I want to hear your thoughts, because I haven't seen you really or mention it specifically in the book, but there's also another thread that's going through all of this that's forcing it, which is increasing complexity. Right. Over the last 60 years, the driver is the increasing complexity.
Right.
Yeah.
And complexity in the technology, and complexity in management and how you manage organizations, and complexity due to the speed of change. Mm-hmm. For example, in the background, you see this card reader, this guy sitting down, putting cards in. So this is how we did it when I started. Yeah. And so you put your cards in, they usually ran overnight, your job ran overnight, and then it printed out the next morning. How would developers today feel if they hit the enter key and 12 hours later they got a response?
Well, that made me think when I read that or listened to like even like how would people feel maybe 10 years 20 years from now when maybe AI is writing the code, like, hey, these people took, like, they talk about these sprints and delivering increments in first it was like at the end of the sprint, and they started talking about delivering increments in several increments during the sprint, and then we went to continuous delivery, and now it's like continuous delivery is a thing, and like there's little humans involved. So
Right.
um
And there's
it's
some issues with that, but we can talk about later.
yeah, it's interesting just like reading through that and starting here with the punch cards. It was
Yeah,
really,
and one of the things I talk about is our tech stack was really short. It was the operating system and a compiler. That was
yeah,
basically the tech stack. And our testing tools was if it blew up in the middle of a run, you got a core dump of the entire core memory in hexadecimal.
yeah.
And you had to read through the hexadecimal to find the execution path.
Well, it's just, yeah, it's crazy. I mean, and it's like any beginning. Maybe it's easy to look at it back now and laugh at it, but it's also like at that time it was good and new.
Oh, right.
But what stands out is we a lot of times in Agile and Lean we talk about feedback loops, and it seems like similar as the complexity as we went from Wild Wild West to structure to roots of Agile to Agile, like the feedback loop seems to increase and get shorter and shorter.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have to have that because of the speed of development. And so basically the Wild West was there was basically no methodology.
Yeah.
You just did what you had to do.
Figure it out.
And you talk to people who had been around a little longer, and maybe they had some patterns that they used. For example, I had a mentor at my first job, and he showed me how to do a tape file, transaction file in, master file in, update the master file, and proceed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were routines like that. But for example, there were a few books on like COBOL and Fortran on the languages, but there were no books on software development techniques, processes, those kinds of things, and very, very little on project management. So you just sort of did it by the seat of your pants. And then as the 70s rolled along, you started getting people like Tom DeMarco and Ken Orr who were doing some structured things, who were basically doing diagramming to get requirements, to do design, to do program design, a little bit later to do database design. And so these structured methods evolved during the 1980 to 1990 period. Mm-hmm. And the technology at that point in time was terminals, so you got pretty good feedback, but they were character terminals. So you had no, you had no GUI interfaces. You had just a terminal interface, and it was very primitive. And then what happened was a combination of really the management style at the time, a project management approach based on building things like boats and ships and buildings came into play, which was very much waterfall oriented. Mm-hmm. A misinterpretation of the original article by Walker Royce, who said, don't do waterfall development, do iterative development, but everybody looked at the diagram and pulled the diagram out and started using it. And so all that resulted in the tools of structured methods got rolled into these very complex methodologies. Mm-hmm. And they were a burden, and they were slowing things down. And that's why the 90s, the kind of the roots of Agile, people started looking at those kinds of things and saying, that takes too long, costs too much, it doesn't give us what we need in our environment now.
Yeah. It's really interesting, and something, as you said, that human desire to simplify things, right? Like we want to codify, simplify, and that perhaps works if we go back to Cynefin. That works in what Dave calls the order systems, the obvious and the complicated, but as that shred of complexity increased over the last 40, 50, 60 years, the idea for moving from order systems to complex systems and chaotic. What does he call it? Like the left side is ordered, and then he divides the complex into complex and chaotic. Why was Cynefin, like, maybe coming back to you? When did you first get introduced to Cynefin, and like why was it so important to put it and have it as one of the key kind of frameworks or methods that you use? Or I don't know, would you? This is you might have a around the method and the methodology.
I did a lot of studying of complex adaptive systems during the 90s, and I actually read more books on biology and physics and other science than I did in software development during that period of time. Wow. So I was really into the complex adaptive systems, complexity, and those kinds of things. And in fact, the title of my first book changed from radical software development to adaptive software development because of that interest in adaptiveness. And so when I came across Dave's framework, to me, it was a graphical and simple explanation of how things, basically the rate of change and the complexity of the change. And so I like to use that because it's a fairly graphic model and it's a fairly simple model, although it's not simplistic in any stretch of the imagination. And I like the idea that as you go from the less to the more complex and change, that you have to use different tools and strategies. And so the tools and strategies that you used in the 80s for systems of the 80s weren't working for the systems of the 90s. And the systems that you will need in the future when you have AI and quantum computing, they may not be the same as you need today. And it actually is one of the reasons that I like the name of your company, because in the book, I talk about methods, methodologies, and mindset. And methods are things like structured diagrams or refactoring method. A methodology is the assembly of methods into a life cycle. And then mindset, of course, is how you go up thinking about what you're trying to do. And what I would say in a way is that Agile has become synonymous with methodology. You have Agile methodologies like Scrum or XP or some of the other ones. And they require an agility mindset. So to me, agility is more of a mindset. And Agile methodologies might go away. But the need for agility is not going to go away because our environment is not going to get any less complex over the next few years.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like, if we talk about complex adaptive systems, and if you go back to Cynefin and complex and chaotic, they are another thing that you talk about is emergence, but they are emergent. I would say, like, based on your description, emergent methods and emergent methodologies. So it's not like right now we have Scrum and everybody, or people want to, swear by Scrum. But I think they
or swear at it.
What is it?
Or swear at it.
Yeah. And the best description that Dave Snowden gave me for Scrum is like, Scrum is a framework, but in your context, methodology that takes a complex system and moves it into complicated for 2 weeks, and that's what it does, right? You create certainty for 2 weeks. You have dedicated team, cross-functional team, and that works in my opinion in low level complexity or low, but in higher complexity, as we kind of talk about Agile and moving into agility, I think it's really about coming up with I talk about cooks and chefs and recipes. It's about being able to come up with our own recipes based on the context in high complexity. What are your thoughts maybe on that idea of, if we want to say, based on Cynefin, that we're in high complexity, pushing towards chaos sometimes, is there a place for frameworks like Scrum, Kanban, or is it more that these evolve into something else? What is your thought on the approach to complexity? Is it a framework, even lightweight frameworks, or what would you say?
Well, I would think that what has happened is some of those frameworks have become static.
Yeah.
And some of them have been prescriptive. I mean, I know people that have said, we have to do these six steps in Scrum, or they're going to kick us out.
Answer the 3 questions. Yeah.
And so I look at those kinds of things as prescriptive methodologies. And for example, SAFE is a prescriptive methodology, or it tends to be that way. Yeah. But if you actually look at some of the stuff in SAFE, which I've done recently, it's not too bad. It's actually got some good stuff in there. The problem is that we get so hung up on the prescriptions that we forget about the best piece, which is the generative piece. Good methodologies and good frameworks generate change when and where you need that change. So if you need something to address something that's more complex in your environment, you may need to leave your prescription and generate what you need. And so, for example, take XP, for example. Mm-hmm. There's 12 practices of XP. Is that all you need? No, but it's a nice, simple model. And one of the things that happened in the early 2000s is one of the competitions for Agile methodologies was rational.
Yeah.
And it was a very prescriptive methodology. It had tons of information, and it was pretty good. The problem was that I could look at any piece of that and say, could I ever use that? And I said, yes. Could I use this? Yes. And pretty soon you had, for a particular project, you had too much stuff. It wasn't simple enough. Because it's always, when you're looking at it, it's always say, I'm going to use this. Whereas if you start with something like XP, and it's very simple, and then you expand, you have to do something that's a little bit more complex. You say, okay, I'll add XYZ to XP for this particular project. Mm-hmm. So I think people have, what I have labeled, they get too hung up on prescriptive agility. And that's an oxymoron. Prescriptive agility, and as opposed to adaptive agility. And I think it's because of this not understanding that whatever framework you're using, it has to be modifiable at the project level, at the organization level, so to meet the challenges of the new environment. So, for example,
absolutely. And like the thing is, I had Dean on this podcast. I had Scott Ambler on this podcast, and when you talk to them, that's this exact same message that they give. Like, hey, this is collection of patterns. I think even Dad or DA has the right idea of like, hey, here are things, you need to configure them, or you need to understand how to, contextualize them to your own environment. But it goes to the third piece that you talk about, which is the mindset. So you talk about methods, methodology, and mindset. It's how it's implemented in organizations. And as a consultant, you know this, I'm sure, that even like something like SAFE, companies and leaders see it. It looks attractive, especially earlier versions where it had portfolio, program, team level. It speaks their language. So how much is it that mindset piece that people are misinterpreting or not, maybe, talking about mindset as an operating system? How about where people have not upgraded their mindsets to understand how to deal with complexity, how to embrace the uncertainty, to understand the emergence? How much do you think our mindsets are limiting and probably impacting the way that these even methodologies are described and implemented?
I think that's probably the biggest influence, particularly as you try to scale up. I think for a particular, if you look at the evolution since about 2000, initially we did small agile teams, kind of rogue teams, I call them. And then we moved on to doing agile more in software development organizations. And then since about 2010, 11, we've done things like digital transformation in an organization.
Yeah.
And I think what we've run into there is a mindset in the management world that is much different and harder to crack. And one of the things I say in the book, a lot of us technologists and project management people don't have the organizational change skills. I could operate fine at the small department level or the team level, but once it gets to an organization level, I need some help from people who are true organization change specialists. And
that's another question that I wanted to ask around organizational change management, because that's changed. Of how people look at organizational change, from like just communicating to driving some of these changes to today, where I think, and I'm interested to hear your perspective on how, through these paradigms, how has organizational change and how we define it evolved? And how is that, like you alluded to it here, that's one of the limiting factors. But from your perspective, how has organizational change evolved over these four, let's just say, paradigms?
Well, I think organizational change is part of this overall agility leadership mindset.
Yeah.
And so the change, if you have a change oriented, adaptable oriented mindset, then of course you're going to look for different kinds of change agents. But I think it all goes down to, if you look at a team, if you look at a department, if you look at a company, that you can only be as agile as the leader of that group.
Oh,
so if you have
now
a team,
you got me thinking. Yeah, but you got me thinking now, and I don't know how familiar you are with Bill Joyner's stuff and some of the work on human value systems and how we evolve as human beings cognitively. And you're absolutely right. Even in the Frederick Laloux's book, he talks about how like you can only go as far as your leader. So it goes back again to the mindset. Even change management and all of this is tied to the leadership mindset. And if a lot of times leadership is driving the change, it all comes down to the to the mindset.
Let me give you something. Let me tell you about something that has occurred to me recently.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of people like myself, probably like you, probably like a lot of other people. Pete Behrens, some of the other people involved in this kind of business agility. And we are good at thinking about leadership qualities and writing about it. Mm-hmm. And even using some of them in our consulting. How many of us have ever sat in a major corporation C-level position? Mm-hmm. And so I got this idea. One of the best books that I've read recently is this one.
Oh yes, IBM, yeah.
Jenny Robity's Good Power, and she was the CEO of IBM for 8 years, and has recently written this book. And I started reading through this book, and I started marking yellow marks on it, and I'm thinking, this lady knows what agility is all about, and she balances performance and empathy in ways that I hadn't really seen other people do. And so I've really gotten on this gig of reading written books so that I can hear what the CEOs themselves say, and not what people like I say about leadership, but what they say about leadership. And it's been a real eye-opener.
That's a really good point, because it's really about that. The way that she talks about empathizing and understanding others, empathizing with leaders that are driving these changes, understanding things from their perspective, and more seeking to understand rather than judge, I guess. That would
right.
Yeah. Interesting. It's been really like, and some of the stuff that you mentioned, Pete and others in the Agile community, like that's what I was referring to, like Bill Joyner stuff. But I agree. We need to better understand the leadership, and not just leadership. I think it goes back to the empathy. Just taking a little bit more time to understand. Empathy, and there's a story about empathy that I tell, and I maybe shared a couple of times on the podcast. But like, my dad was in 3 concentration camps in Bosnia, and in Muslim concentration camps with Christians. And when he got out, he heard me saying, I despise Muslims. And he heard me one time say, and he smacked me and said, I don't want you ever to say that in front of me again. There are only good and bad people. And I didn't listen to him still then, but it was still I was in college, and I double major in the computer and information systems and communication. And it was actually, I joke around, I say like I learned more in my communications major than in my CIS. But one of my teachers got me to think. There was something about empathy, and I brought up this thing. I think he brought up who you despise or something like that. How to understand their perspective. And he got me to think. He said, like, Milan, think about that you're that Muslim kid on the other side, thinking about you, somebody that hasn't done anything to him, hating them, and just for 2 minutes, just forget who you are. Forget where you come from, in a sense, and just pretend that you're this person, and see how world looks from that perspective. And he's like, if you really want to understand other people and not judge them like that, spend a little bit of time seeing how they see you and how they see others. And that really triggered a set of things for me, where like it even changed my mindset on how I saw the whole war, based on that idea of empathy and looking and understanding world from somebody else's perspective. So when you said, like, we don't understand and we don't do a good job as consultants, stepping into a world of a C-suite executive and thinking from and seeing the world from their perspective, we're quick to judge them and say, oh, only if they could get their shit together, everything
Right.
would be better, and the whole organization would, achieve organizational agility. So just this little side note about empathy. I know you talk about empathy a lot, and so that's something that I share a lot of times, as far as like what that means, to empathize, what it means.
One of the interesting things is there are not that many books written by CEOs.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books written about CEOs, but the ones that I found are one of the great ones was Shoe Dog by Phil Knight at Nike. And that was a really interesting perspective of a different kind of CEO. Robert Iger from Disney wrote a book not too long ago. And there are a few of them out there, but it's interesting. It's really different, as I said. Oh, yeah, and the one by the guy who's the CEO of Microsoft came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And I have just found it really enlightening and interesting to get their different perspectives on the job of a CEO, rather than read about somebody who wrote a book about a CEO. And there are not a lot of books to go from, but the ones that are out there are pretty good. And I think my overall take of reading these is that some of these CEOs are a lot more agile than we give them credit for.
Mm-hmm. So another question for you, in context of complex adaptive systems or complexity, how much does the system itself force people to act certain ways? So for instance, like if we look at the system as organizational design or organizational architecture, if you talk about going from very siloed hierarchies to more of network teams, how much does that or maybe I know in this you kind of describe it, but maybe for the audience, could you spend a little bit of time talking about how the systems, organizational systems, influence our behaviors and perhaps our mindsets as well, and ultimately they influence the delivery or agility of the organization?
Obviously, those systems, both formal and informal, are really, really important because they tend to perpetuate what you're doing today. That's what they're set up to do. They're set up to optimize what you're doing today. And that's a good thing. But they get entrenched. And one of the things in my book as I look back over 60 years and looked at what are the characteristics, what are the action characteristics of leaders who made a difference and who pioneered these different areas. And I came up with several things. One of which was that they've got to be adventurous. They've got to be able to step outside the norm. And to that extent, they have to be somewhat of a nonconformist. So they have to be a little nonconformist and adventurous to step outside of those systems in order to change them. And then they've got to be adaptive in terms of looking at what's going on, being realistic in their assessment, and going through an action learning phase. But I think this idea of adventurousness and nonconformity is really important. And I actually think you could go into an organization and query them about those two things and tell me the people that you think are adventurous and nonconformist at each level. And if you don't have very many of them, your transformation efforts are going to be really hindered.
Yeah, because it's so easy, especially if you're incentivized to conform, right. To the current system. And if you're under pressure, I remember one executive telling me, Milan, I know what the right thing to do is, but I have kids in college,
Right.
And
well, it was interesting. There was a huge multi-$100 million debacle back in the 80s, and it had to do with one of the big companies in Texas. And so they started wondering why the debacle happened. And management said, well, the project leaders were lying to us. Well, what happened was when the project leaders took status reports to these guys, they would say, this isn't working too well. And the leaders would say, the executives would say, we don't want to hear that. We want to hear everything's going right. So what happened? They're not going to tell them anything because they didn't want to hear the bad stuff.
Yeah. So
the systems do make it difficult. And the more you have those systems set up to take on the operations, the normal operations, and you don't support in multiple different ways these offshoots that are going to be the offshoots for change, then you're going to have problems. And those offshoots have got to be funded and really, really nurtured. I mean, think about sitting in a Kodak boardroom in the late 1990s, and you have the senior vice president of the film division who comes in and says, I need $50 million for my projects, and I'm going to give you a 20% return rate in 2 years. And then the director of the digital camera division comes in and says, I need $25 million, and I don't know how long it's going to take to get any return. Who's going to get the money, right? So Kodak, actually a Kodak guy in the early 1980s invented the digital camera. Kodak invented it, but they just were so caught up in their internal system that they weren't funding and supporting this offshoot that basically killed their company.
Yeah. And you see now just companies buying other startups to prevent that, to make sure that doesn't happen. But maybe just something else that caught my attention in context of an organizational system or methodology framework, you use Jorgen Appello's Unfix model to kind of show, hey, here's traditional, here's that. How did that come about? Because let's. How did you?
I'm not sure how Jurgen and I originally met, but I've been following his stuff for quite a number of years. And he went from his Management 3.0 book, and then he got involved in the gamification app on iPhones or cell phones. as a business. And then sometime about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, no, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, I saw what he was doing with this Unfix model.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that's really an important piece, because if you want to be really agile and agile as an organization, you've got to be able to change the organization
Exactly.
quickly just to match what you're trying to do. And I really like this concept because it's very real to people of Lego block organizations. And you can plug in these Lego blocks in multiple different ways to support different kinds of organizations. And you could have different kinds of Lego and different complexity. And I think this is really a good model for digital transformations in organizations. I think it's one of the 4 or 5 things you need to do those transformations, but it's an important piece.
Exactly. And I think when I spoke to him, I was surprised like how much his work and his background is also based in complexity management, understanding complexity. And you can see, obviously in his work that that comes across. But and I agree, and I a lot of times tell people that probably something like Unfix or something similar to that is what we're going to see emerge over the next 5-10 years, or so a lot of versions of something like that, because it's all these different patterns. I mean, you can see with what he did with the team typologies and what's happening now, and looking at merging. And this is another thing that I think you mentioned in the book. You said like how software development is poorly understood by business executives, but in general, it's not just. I think it's vice versa too. A lot of IT people don't fully understand the business side of things, and it kind of goes back to the empathy, understanding, and merging the two, and focusing on the customer.
Right. That's one of the reasons I feel thankful that I've been in management positions. I've been in technical positions. I've gone back and forth. I've been in senior management positions in smaller companies, and it's really given me an appreciation for different functions in the organization. And if you understand those different functions, you're less likely to throw rocks at them.
Exactly. Well,
so to go along with Unfix,
that goes back to complexity. Like if we're saying that over the 4 again, I'll refer to them as paradigms that you outline in your book, Wild West, structured, roots of agile. If we're moving in that high complexity, we as I guess humans, or however you want people in organizations, we need to understand how things work when they're complex adaptive systems, and that things that worked 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are not going to work, that our mindset have to be upgraded to be okay with uncertainty, to be okay with kind of dealing with things as we go, inspect and adapt, right? Being okay and seeking emergence. I think, it's a quote from Michael Crichton, I think, that you put, like, only at the edge of chaos can complex systems flourish, which also caught my attention. It's a quote that you put
right
in the book. What did that?
One of the things I was just thinking about is you were talking about Jurgen's Unfix model a little while ago. Yeah. Maybe we need an Unfix model to go. I mean, an unsafe model to go with it. And I say that and give SAFE a lot of credit for some of the things that they've done. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Yeah. But my concern about a prescriptive approach is that you lose the one of the things that I think is absolutely critical to survive in this coming world, and has been for a time, is innovation. So how do you scale innovation as opposed to just scale the normal operations of things? And I think that's where, mindset wise, I'm not sure SAFE gives off the right message. Correct.
But it's appealing to people with a mindset that likes certainty, that likes stability. And that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons why it's become successful. But again, when I talk to Dean, he knows. It's just that he knows his audience really well as well, and he knows what they want. And having a sales background, I think you know how well he does that.
Oh, he's done a really good job. Yes, I think some of the complaints, don't take into account that from a business perspective, he's done really, really well, and I have to give him credit for that.
So I'm interested in a couple of things that are tied to this, and I know we've been jumping. It's like there's so many ways that and so many interesting topics that we could take this, but I think in a similar way, Ken Schwaber has done something similar with what he originally did with Scrum Alliance and Scrum Master certification, similar to what Dean is doing with SAFe,
Right.
in a sense, but without Ken and without Dean, I also don't think this awareness about these methodologies or ways wouldn't be the same. So I'm curious you worked with Ken. I don't know how extensively you worked with Dean. You live in the same area, but how much do you think and how much credit should we give them for not necessarily the frameworks that they brought and shared and popularized, but how much they contributed to the awareness of these agile methods?
Oh, I think they did a great job of that. And I think we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today without some of that promotion that was done. And whether you like the idea of a 2-day Scrum certification or not, it was what people bought into, and it became widely known. And I always go back to Jerry Weinberg's law of raspberry jam. The wider you spread it, the thinner it gets. And so the wider you spread knowledge of Agile, some of the edges are going to be pretty damn thin in terms of what they understand about it. And that's just natural, no matter what kind of phenomena you're talking about. And so I think sometimes you can't look at the edges where the knowledge is really thin and say that's a problem, because that's just a natural evolution. And one of the things I think today, I think there's a lot of backbiting, I guess, between different factions.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that some of the new stuff lacks is this idea of inspiration. And I think one of the things the original manifesto and some of the early work did is it really inspired people. And they got a lot of internal motivation to move forward. And I think some of that inspiration and aspiration has gotten lost. And that's one of the things that I'm sort of asking people as I write things today is, why do you think Agile was so successful? What do we need to take out of the Agile movement that we need to keep? And what do we need to move forward on and do things a little differently? So we're not throwing it away. We're taking the best parts and saying, this is the core that we'll keep, and then we'll add some stuff to it. And I think there's too many issues in the world that we need to deal with. And I think agility is one of the ways of dealing with them. And let's stop infighting and move forward.
I agree. And I wanted to ask you this question, or a couple of questions about Agile Manifesto as well. First one is, I think you've answered it, but I want to hear it here. From your perspective, what's the core message of Agile Manifesto?
I think the core purpose of the Agile Manifesto, in fact, I actually wrote this in a response to a LinkedIn comment the other day, was delivering better products or software or whatever you're doing. So there's a performance aspect of it. We're learning how to deliver better software. And then the second piece of it, we're trying to build more empathetic organizations where we can have at least a satisfaction and fun. And so there's a product piece and a people piece. And I think that's the core message of the Agile Manifesto. And I think that's the reason that people got so excited about it.
Exactly. And I think if we now go all the way to the beginning and to Cynefin and to the, probably not necessarily Wild Wild West, but to structured and maybe early roots of Agile, the way that I see it is the way that you guys wrote, or the way that the Agile, because the Agile Manifesto emerged Like you guys didn't
Right.
know, it's just happened.
Right.
And the way that I see it is that Agile Manifesto was written during the complicated era for a complex era, and it was written in a complex language, in the sense that it wasn't framed like other methods or other methodologies, but it was actually just in a context of values and principles, which is a language of complexity and patterns. So I think the reason that it's lived so long and that has resonated with people, it was written at the end of one paradigm or towards the end of one paradigm for a new paradigm in a language of a new paradigm. And that's why it's been resonating with us for so long because of that. So that's my conclusion in the sense of what I think, why the Agile Manifesto and why it inspires. But what do you think about? What do you think?
I think as I was writing the book, I came up with this. Isn't it ironic that a manifesto written by 17 techies dealt primarily with people and organizations and collaboration?
Well, but I don't know how many of you, like, this is another thing that I've asked. I've had other people, Agile Manifesto signees. Like, there's definitely, it's clear that some of you were familiar with the complexity and complex adaptive systems. Not everyone, probably, yeah. So, like, how much did that play into the way that the Agile Manifesto emerged? Because I think it probably had a huge impact of why it ended up the way it did.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look, Kent Beck was really into complexity theory. Alistair was to some extent, Martin Fowler was to some extent.
I mean, Jeff, I would say, I would put Jeff to some extent. Yeah.
And so there were a number of us that were really, to one degree or another, impacted by this idea of complex adaptive systems theory. So I don't remember expressing it explicitly during the meeting, but I think it was built into the way we went about meeting without any kind of objective in mind and not knowing what was going to happen. And I think, like you said, it was an emergent process that we all understood, I think, maybe better than some other people might have understood it.
Yeah. And what's funny too is that it's 23 or so years, 22, and that message and what you guys put together still stands true, and we're still talking about complex adaptive systems. Yet, if you look at organizations, they're still stuck in that complicated thinking that we're in complicated, where we've actually the systems have evolved and we have complex systems. So it's like environment around us has changed. It's become more messier, and yet we haven't realized that the old tools.
Right.
Well, maybe we're starting.
Still a lot of people that believe, in cause and effect, right?
Yeah.
That there's a direct link, and you just have to find out what that link is.
What the root cause.
And basically, emergence says no, there's no link in there, but there's a pattern that you can use that's going to work, a lot of the time. One of the things I talk about is the fact that there's a difference between a repeatable process and a reliable process. Mm-hmm. And a repeatable process is used in manufacturing. So you repeat the generation or the building of a particular part time after time after time, and you want them absolutely the same. And you're really careful about the inputs, and you're really careful about the process, and you're really careful about quality control on the output. So that is a repeatable process. One of the reasons that software development projects are successful is because they're reliable process, not repeatable. And reliable means you change and adapt as you go forward to meet the goals of the project or product, but you know that you're going to have to take some detours. And it's a whole different thing, but it's still, it's reliable, but it's not repeatable. And I think I've used those two words.
Well, that, and it's like you've talked. I wish we could cover every single topic, but you talked about knowledge work, and you talk about how in a sense, like with knowledge work, there's no, like you say, repetition, and there's like software development is a creative work, and it's not like just, oh, I need to copy this, and you're probably heard this story many times where people are replacing an old system and they say, we just need the exact same, we just need to copy what we have. And going in with that mindset is very difficult. And I agree, like, your point in your book about the mindset. We talked during the Agile Manifesto about the mindset and culture that we need to create. And, today, 22, 23 years later, it's just it's like we're still talking about the same point that you guys made is probably more important than ever, but this goes.
Yeah, and I think again, if you look at that as the base for agility,
Yeah,
as opposed to agile methodology, I think that's one of the things that brings it into the present and into the future. And what we have to do is take this word agility, or in business agility or enterprise agility, and really help people understand what it means at the business and enterprise level, because that is where things have got to change if we're going to confront some of the problems we have in the world today, which are very, very complex problems.
so from your perspective, how do you change a mindset and a culture? Those would be called usually this, the more less visible systems, or how do you, from your perspective, change mindsets of leaders, of people? How do you change culture?
I knew the answer to that, I'd make a lot more money than I do now.
What are some of the ways that you've seen they maybe influence it?
Well, I think it's I think a lot of people understand the issues. If you do some surveys, or you look at some McKinsey surveys, for example, that a lot of CEOs and C-level executives understand what the issues are and know that that's something they need to move forward. For example, digital transformation. But it's very difficult to change their internal mindsets. And one of the things that I think happens here is that we think mindsets ought to change as too rapidly. We don't give things, we're not patient when it comes to mindset. And I think we have to do more patience. It took me in the 90s a decade to evolve my mindset from a structured to an agile mindset. And there were times in there were a couple of different stages in that, and I think we can do it faster than a decade, but I think we've got to figure out how to internally motivate people to do that. We can't just tell them they got to do it. We can't just tell them it's hard. We can't just tell them what the problems are.
And when you say, just to clarify, when you say internally, you mean intrinsically, like not internal,
intrinsically,
like, yeah.
So I go back to Pink's model. Autonomy,
mastery, purpose. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a real important model to look at when we're looking at autonomy within an organization as opposed to empowerment. We're looking at purpose, which I just talked about in terms of the Agile Manifesto, and then mastery, really understanding the nuances of mastering a knowledge base.
I think it's even like, as I've dug deeper into, like, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Spade's work and what Lisa Atkins have been doing.
I've talked to him and Jenna.
Yeah.
Jenna. His colleagues.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, but like, I think, from his, like, the other aspect that they bring is like this whole, like, from intrinsically looking at human values. And this is what I was saying earlier. Like, it's I think that's something perhaps that combining all of this, like both the organizational design, the way they talk about it is combining the practices, the systems, like the organizational architecture and other policies, combining the mindset and culture, and seeing the interplay between those to influence that holistic change. And the way that they talk about is integral change. So it's really, I'm excited about next 5 to 10 years, because I think there's a lot of this we're now I think there's going to be a new paradigm that's emerging after Agile, and it's going to be about, like you said, about agility, but I think many different methodologies and methods will emerge from that, but I could be wrong. And I know
one of the things I think about in terms of I look at the Business Agility Institute, and I've talked to Pete about this, and I look at their journal, their Emergence Journal, and there's a lot of good work in there. My concern about it is that it seems to be very academic. And I think we have to take that baseline of material and simplify the message to run it up the flagpole to the senior executives, because they're not going to sit by and, sit through a 2-hour presentation on the use of complex adaptive systems in their business. You've got to change the message. So I think people like yourself and me, who are kind of grown up being communicators, have got to figure out ways to help the consulting pundit community, and the academic community write stuff that's going to be acceptable in the C-level in organizations.
That speaks to them, and that's it's definitely something that I think we need, and I think something will emerge. I can see just how much stuff is brewing in different parts of the communities that I think something will emerge. We're over an hour, and we could spend more time. It's just like your book and just your experience in general is so vast.
Well, one of the things that I hope to do with the book is to give somebody some history to look at, to see what had gone on before, and provide some background for moving forward.
Yeah. And this is another thing, I don't know if I'm wrong, but another pattern that I've seen or observed is that in software development, it's rarely that you see software engineers. There are a few, like Ken and others, but it's usually somebody that has software engineering background, project management, change management, that's describing and better articulating things the rest of the community. And I think you've done that, and you've taken almost the ownership of saying, like, look, this is where we came from. This is how things have emerged over the last 50, 60 years. And I can only thank you for taking the time to write the book and to describe it, because I have the same thinking as you, that this is really important to remember as where we came from and how things were. And even not to forget, going back to the Agile Manifesto and your message about the complexity and about, what is this all about? It's about people. It's about, mindsets, about, understanding where you're at. So what would you like to leave us as a last message? Maybe, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked?
I can't think of anything specifically. I'll change my background.
Yeah.
And so we've come from an era of punch cards and printouts to an era where you have a family sitting around in their living room with all kinds of electronic devices, and who knows what will come next with AI and some other things. And so we're always changing. We're always I started to say advancing, but maybe some of it is not advancing. But things are not going to get less complex, and we're not going to need less agility. We're going to need more agility, and the wider that agility is spread, the more chance we have of solving problems at the team level, at the software development level, and the organizational level And I think to me, that's one of the things I want to be involved in, is this whole idea of moving agility into more parts of the organization. And I think we in the software development project management community have a responsibility to do that, because we're a group that has been successful in implementing agile methods very widely in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Probably more widely than people who are just dealing with the management level have in instilling agility into organizations. And so hopefully they can use our help.
I hope so too, because I do feel like the the complexity is, or the world is getting messier, not simpler. So well, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been fun.
Reading your book, speaking with you has been a privilege, and thank you, and hopefully we can do this again. I've been meaning to do like some type of panel discussion between people in complexity and are familiar with complexity and complex adaptive system, just to kind of share different thoughts and exchange different thoughts on where we are currently, where we might be going, and things like that. So I might,
and I've talked to a couple of people too, and I think it's a topic that's smoldering, and maybe some fire will come.
Well, I think so. That's something like 5 years ago, 10 years ago wasn't as common. Now I think more and more people are discussing it, and it goes back to what you said. It takes time. Like we want things to happen over weeks, months, years, but it usually takes decades for some of this stuff to really become, or for majority of people to become aware of these things. So thank you, and hope to see you soon or sometime in the future on similar.
Yeah, let's keep in touch.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert.
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.